Thanks for joining me. We are back with part 2 of the exposure triangle, and this is where we take the theory and put it into practice. We're going to be looking at some real world examples, and you're going to be able to use that exposure triangle that we covered in the last video. And if you haven't done so already, go ahead and go print off that exposure triangle printout. It's located in the description of this video, and go ahead and print it off and then follow along. You're going to be able to put your knowledge to the test to see if you are ready to shoot in manual. So this is practicing in manual mode, and I will walk you through it. We'll stop and ask questions. Pause the video as needed. All right, come join me. Let's head on over there and let's go ahead and begin the process. Let's go ahead and start looking at those examples. Thanks for joining me. Let's go ahead and go. Let's get started. Before we delve in, one of the key differences between a mirrorless camera and a DSLR camera is that on a mirrorless camera, you can see exactly what you're shooting. What I mean by that is that anytime that I switch any of the settings, I can actually see it live on there. So for example, right now, if I start increasing my shutter speed, I can actually start seeing the image get darker and darker. And if I start lowering down my shutter speed or changing any of the settings, I can actually see the image change right before my eyes. So what you see is what you get. The difference on a DSLR camera, of course, you can always put it on live view and you can start seeing the same thing, but it is a little bit slower to do that. So even when you are shooting, most people are not going to be shooting in live view because look how long it takes for it to take the picture. Most people are going to be shooting through the viewfinder, and look what happens when you shoot on a DSLR camera as you look through the viewfinder. So when you look through the viewfinder, this is what happens. So you can see all the settings on the bottom, but look at the image. The image remains exactly the same. So a lot of the times it gets very difficult, especially when you're shooting indoor and then you step outside. Your settings have to switch very quickly. So what you have to rely on here is that light meter on the side of there. So right now it's telling us that there is not enough light. So I'm going to start lowering down my shutter speed, and right about there, right at 0, is when it tells us that we have a correct exposure. Now we don't know what the exposure is going to look like until we take the picture. So I took a shot. Now let's look on the back of the camera here, and there it is. But if you're going to be shooting weddings where the scene changes constantly, you probably want to go ahead and switch on over to a mirrorless camera, because anytime you switch your settings, you can actually see what's happening. So if you go from a darker scene to a lighter scene, you can see exactly as it changes. And sometimes you forget to look at that light meter and you take a shot and you get it overexposed or underexposed. So just wanted to touch base on that, so that way if you were barely thinking about getting a new camera, mirrorless is the way to go. So everything that I see on the back of this camera as if it were on live view on a DSLR camera, I will also be seeing that in the viewfinder here. So notice the viewfinder, when I change the settings also change here in the viewfinder. So it's not like a DSLR camera like I just showed you. When you change the settings, nothing happens. Everything you see on the image remains exactly the same, but not here. So it is kind of difficult here to show you, but so everything on the back is the same thing. Everything on the back is what you see inside of the viewfinder on a mirrorless camera. So on this first image, we are shooting on a 50mm 1.8. All right, so here is our very first scene, and right now our light meter that's blinking here is telling us that we have too much light. There's too much light. It's tipping over to the plus side. That means it's too much light, and you can definitely see it on the ABF. But if you don't have a mirrorless camera, you won't be able to see that. So the very first thing that I want to do is I want to reduce my light. So I'm going to go ahead and drop that ISO. And the reason that I'm dropping the ISO is just because I want a cleaner shot. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that down as far down. So usually it's ISO 100 on this camera, but it can drop even more. The image is now moving more toward a correctly exposed image of how I want it, but it's still not quite there. And usually my shutter speed, I don't like to drop it more than 2/50th of a second. I'm gonna go ahead and close up my aperture because I wanna get more of the scene in focus. So I'm gonna go ahead and start closing my aperture. And I'm gonna keep closing it to maybe f5. And then my shutter speed, I'm gonna go ahead and make my shutter speed a lot quicker. And this shot looks just about right. So I'm gonna focus right here on the dock, and I'm gonna snap a shot. And I'm actually gonna recompose, and then I'm gonna focus right here on the dock. And there it is. And so that's my shot. I've correctly exposed it. And so using the exposure triangle, I was able to look at that. And also, if you look at the light meter right now, it's right at 0. So that is how you get a properly exposed image on there. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and see if we can get just a different shot here. We're already here. The next lens that we are shooting with is this 24 to 120. And there's the aperture, 3.5 to 5.6. All right, let's go ahead and start with this scene here. So right now, if we look at the light meter, it's tipping over all the way to the negative. That means that there is not enough light, and you can see that on the viewfinder as well. So notice my shutter speed is super high, so I'm gonna go ahead and lower that to where I'm comfortable shooting by hand. I know this is on a tripod right now, so I'm gonna lower that shutter speed down to gain more light. We're looking at our exposure triangle to guide us. And I'm lowering it down to about 1/250th of a second. And now I'm gonna go ahead and open up my aperture, but I can't because of the lens. The lens does not allow me to stop it down anymore because it's not a fast prime lens. So this is a kit lens. So now what I have to do is bring up my ISO. So I'm increasing my ISO till the image looks just about right. And I think that's good right there. I'm gonna go ahead and focus just anywhere on this building. And then I'm gonna snap a shot. And we're just gonna shoot a couple different shots here just in the same spot. And I'm gonna zoom out. And notice how we gain light on there, so I'm going to lower my ISO a bit. Snap another shot here. That was our image here. Alright, we're gonna go shoot this mug here, and we're gonna be using the 50 to do this. And why the 50? Because it's got a wider aperture, and I want to get as much blur as I can behind this mug here. Alright, so right now we have this scene here, and it's super dark. So if you're looking at the exposure triangle, and the very first thing you want to do is that you want to get maximum bokeh here, or you want to get the most amount of blur out of your scene. You want to separate your subject from your background. You're going to want to open up that aperture. So that's the very first thing I'm going to do here. So I'm going to go ahead and start opening up that aperture. And the lens that I'm using right now is a 51.8. So the exposure looks pretty good right now. I'm just going to close up the aperture again, and I want you to just notice that light meter. That light meter is blinking that it's way too dark. So once again, if you do not have a camera with EVF, you're going to want to rely on that light meter. And so as I start to open it up, notice how that light meter starts getting more closer to that zero there, to that center line. And we just need a little bit more light. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start to slow down my shutter speed. And so I'm going to start slowing it down, and that seems to be a pretty good image right there. So I'm going to go ahead and snap it and look at your light meter and notice how it's at 0. And why didn't I shift around my ISO? Well, I didn't want to mess with my ISO because I want it to be as low as I can so I can get the cleanest shot possible. So let's snap a couple shots here, and right now the composition is good. And we're just going to try it from different angles. And that looks pretty good there. And I was wondering, what should I shoot? And I had this mug in my car, so this is why we're shooting this mug. I didn't know what else to shoot. Okay, that was it for this scene. This will be the lens we will be using to photograph the cars on the freeway here. It's a 24 to 120, and it is a variable aperture lens. So let's do this. Okay, so right now I'm gonna try to capture some motion, and I want to freeze some motion, but I also want to be able to show some motion. So I want my picture to show that either the cars are moving or that the cars are frozen. So you either freeze the action or you show that there is action in your image. So I'm going to look at my exposure triangle, and as I'm looking at it, the setting that controls motion is the shutter speed. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and lower that shutter speed. And as I lower the shutter speed, that means that more light is hitting the sensor, and as you guys are looking at the image here, it's becoming very bright. So I'm going to lower it to about 1 1/40th of a second. And so now that means that I have too much light. So I'm gonna, and I want less light. So looking at my exposure triangle, my ISO is at 1000. So I'm gonna go ahead and lower that so I can get less light and get a correct exposure. Hey, that looks about right. Right about here. So it's less than ISO 100. I'm gonna go ahead and track one of these cars, and then I'm gonna snap a shot and see how that turns out. And here's a bigger truck here that we can follow, and let's see how this goes. Tracking, snapping a few. And so let's go ahead and look at some of those images. So there's a truck, and if I look at it, seems to be mostly in focus. So as you guys look at that image, it shows that there is motion. And let's try a couple more. Let's track this car. And again, here's another one. This one seems to be nice and clean. If you look at, well, the car seems to be nice and sharp. And let's follow this truck here. There it is. If I want it to be a lot sharper, I'd probably put it on a tripod. This is just all handheld. But for the most part, there's this truck here. It's not 100% sharp here, but it does show what I wanted it to show, and that is to show motion, and it's because of the shutter speed and how slow it is. Now let's go ahead and do the opposite, and let's go ahead and freeze the action where everything should be frozen. It shouldn't show any motion blur. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and increase that shutter speed, and I'm probably going to shoot about 1/1000th of a second, and we'll see how that turns out. And notice how the scene is a lot darker now, so I need more light. And unfortunately this lens, the f-stop, I can't adjust it anymore because that's the widest aperture that I can shoot at, is 5.6. So my only option is to increase the ISO. So I'm going to go ahead and increase that ISO, and it should be getting brighter, and we should be getting a correct exposure here, and I can see it on my viewfinder. Alright, I'm going to shoot a couple shots here, track those cars, and let's look at the image. And if you notice the car, it is nice and sharp, and the trees on the side show a little bit of motion blur, but it's not like it was when we were shooting at a lower shutter speed. And I'm actually going to go ahead and increase the shutter speed even faster, so that way we can have everything completely frozen. And I lost a little bit of light as I increased my shutter speed. Now I'm going to go ahead and boost up that ISO, and let's track a couple of other cars as they approach. And so there's that car right there, nice and sharp. It seems like it's just frozen there. So it is important to understand the shutter speed if you are wanting to freeze motion or you're wanting to show some motion blur. One other thing I wanted to show is the car to be in motion and not the rest of the scene, not the rest of the background. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring that shutter speed down again because I want to show some motion blur. So I'm going to bring it down to about 1/40th of a second. And then my scene right now is too bright, and so I'm going to lower down that shutter speed. And I'm just going to go ahead and wait for a car to pass through the scene, or a truck, and then I'm just going to shoot here. And so everything, the background should be frozen, and the only thing that is in motion are the cars. So here we go. There's that motorcycle. There's that car. And let's try one more here. There's that car. And now, let's go ahead and look at those images. So notice how the cars are in motion. Not that one. The cars are in motion. The truck is in motion here. There's that car. You can see motion blur. And that car, this car as well. The scene here is nice and sharp except for the subject, which is the cars, and those are the ones moving, and that's the one showing some motion blur. So depending on what you want from your scene, if you're shooting sports, if you want to show your players running and moving, then you follow and you track. But if you just want your players to show motion, then you just keep your camera steady and then you just shoot in that manner. Alright, we're out here shooting at night. We have some buildings in front of us, and so these are our settings for now. And so the very first thing that I'm going to start doing here is I'm going to bring down my shutter speed, and I'm going to bring it down to something that is comfortable for me. And so usually when I shoot handheld, I like to shoot above 1/250th of a second, but it is on a tripod, so I'm gonna lower it down to about 1/100th of a second, and then I'm gonna attempt to open up my shutter speed, but this lens is kind of slow, so it's a variable aperture, and at 24 millimeters, this is as wide as I can on my f-stop, so I can't do anything more on there. So now I'm gonna go ahead and bring up my ISO, and if you notice the light meter keeps blinking and it's saying it's way too dark. And on the EVF we can definitely see that. But if you are not shooting through an EVF, again, you're using a DSLR camera, you won't be able to see your scene change as it is now. So notice how it is already at 12,800, and that's really pushing the ISO on a camera. So, and that looks about right there. I'm going to focus here, and then I'm going to take my shot, and I'm going to take a couple here because of the lower shutter speed. And let me reduce my shutter speed here to, let's go even slower, and notice how the scene is breaking up here. And then I'm going to lower my shutter speed just so I can get a cleaner shot and see where we can get it. So, and let's see if we can get it nice and sharp. There it is. And so with a slower lens like this, you can definitely see why it is beneficial to have a faster lens with a wider aperture at 1.8. So right now in a moment, I'm going to go ahead and switch it out to a 1.8, and we're going to be able to see the difference here. So right now it's at ISO 10,000, and we're going to see if we can lower that there. If you're shooting events and you're shooting handheld, 1/250th of a second is usually about as low as I like to go. So once again, you really have to push your ISO in order to compensate for that, and it just gets ridiculous. And if we look at this image here and we zoom into the image seems to just be falling apart everywhere, as you can tell here. So here we are with the faster lens. So this is a 24 millimeter 1.8, so we get a few more stops of light here. So I'm going to go ahead and stop down that aperture to 1.8 and notice the image. Notice how much light we've gained here, and it's already overexposed. So that gives me the ability to bring down my ISO. That way we can get a much cleaner shot here. That looks about right. It's not quite usable at this ISO. I don't like to shoot this high. I like to keep it around around 6400 is usually where I push mine. We're gonna slow down the shutter speed. let's see, I'm going to take this off the tripod and we're going to attempt to shoot handheld here, and we'll see what we can get. So here's a shot, and here's another shot, and this is all handheld. So do remember that this camera does have in-body stabilization, so that will help with it. So that is one of the benefits of having a faster lens. You're able to get more light because you're able to open up that aperture, and it does allow for a few more stops, and it allows you to keep that ISO down, and it allows you to have a cleaner image. Alright, we're here now on a different scene, and we're going to try to get some light trails. In order to get light trails, we're going to have to drop our shutter speed to at least 5 seconds. So I'm going to start with that, and we'll see where our image is. So dropping it down, 1/8 of a second, 1/5. And now that is 1 second, 2 seconds, and there is 5, and it's overexposed at the moment. So what we're gonna do now is bring our ISO down to get the cleanest shot possible. And so that looks about right there. And so this lens, that's the widest aperture that we can get. So I'm gonna go ahead and set my timer so that way I don't get any shake when I'm pressing the shutter. So set a 2-second timer so that way when I hit the shutter, it'll take 2 seconds for it to shoot the picture, and then it'll go automatically taken. I think it's going to take a few shots. And I'm going to manual focus this just because my autofocus is not working that great at night here. So it looks about right there. I'm going to let the camera do its thing here. And notice how everything went blank. It's capturing in as much light there for 5 seconds, and it's going to do that again repeatedly. I think I have it set for 5 shots or a few more. And as you can see there, we have those light trails there. Let's go through a few of these. And of course, these are not the greatest shots, but it just goes to show. So if you can find a scene where there's a curve and there's a car going through that curve, you can definitely see that the light trails go all the way across that curve, and it's going to be an epic shot. So this is just to show that how you can still accomplish some nice shots by lowering down that shutter speed to a couple of seconds. So not just a fraction of a second, but full seconds. And I'm hoping that you took something from this video. If you did and you like the content, go ahead and subscribe, and go ahead and click that notification bell so that way you receive notifications when the new video is uploaded. Alright, before you go, here's a challenge. Go find somebody in your life that you appreciate, and go ahead and give them a kind gift or a couple of words of appreciation, and then in the comments go ahead and let me know how they reacted. Alright, we'll see you until next time. Alright. Challenge accepted. I see some of you guys nodding. Alright, we'll see you on the next video.